I was standing at my locked steel gate with rain slanting down in silver sheets, the storm wrapping the valley in a dim gray haze. A dozen HOA members stood outside on the slick pavement, their umbrellas bending under the gusts, their voices raised in an angry chorus that blended with the thunder. The sheriff's cruiser idled behind them, red and blue lights spinning across the flooded street. Their president, Karen herself, visor tilted sideways, clipboard clutched like a sword, was shrieking that I had caused the flood now creeping over her beloved cul-de-sac. The sheriff looked at me calm, water dripping from the brim of his hat, and asked if I had anything to do with this mess. I gave him a faint smile, let my eyes travel down to the water spilling over the very concrete slab they had poured across my creek, and said only, "Well, I warned them." That moment, heavy with rain, accusation, and inevitability, was not born in that instant. It had been brewing since the morning they decided to choke a living creek with cement. My land sat at the high edge of the valley, shielded by pines and rooted in a foundation my father and grandfather had tended long before me. Through it ran a creek, cold and clear, humming soft music as it wound through rocks and reeds. I had grown up there fishing beside my father, listening to the rhythm of water tapping against stone, learning early what he always said: "You can't cage water. It will rise. It will carve. It will run somewhere no matter what stands in its way." But Karen and her little empire of beige houses did not see a creek. They saw a drainage ditch, a nuisance, a blemish holding mosquitoes in mud. Their first notes to me had been laughable. Warnings slipped under my gate claiming my waterway created hazards that, failing to maintain it, put their homes at risk. I tossed their letters into my wood stove, chuckling at their pettiness. Surely I thought they had better things to contest, like mismatched siding or improper mailbox heights. But control was their blood sport, and my unbending presence up the hill pricked them harder than any weedy yard in their subdivision. The Saturday morning they finally made their move. I stepped onto my porch with steaming coffee and froze when I saw trucks and mixers lined along my fence. Heavy equipment grumbled while men in reflective vests set rebar across the creek, and there in the middle of it all stood Karen, visor perched, lips pursed, barking orders as if she were storming Normandy. I strode down the gravel path, shouted over the clatter, and asked what in God's name they thought they were doing. She turned, offered a smug little tilt of her head, and announced they were sealing off a safety hazard, voted unanimously by her board. Then, with a smirk that still makes my stomach burn, she waved for her men to continue. The first load of wet gray concrete sloshed into my creek, forcing water to coil and sputter. I raised my phone, took photographs, captured every angle, and warned them this was illegal. She waved me off, claiming county approval, lying with the effortless gall of someone who relies on intimidation instead of truth. I knew the county wouldn't have allowed such folly. No one grants permits to suffocate a natural waterway. But watching them bury a breathing stream beneath slabs of concrete shook me with more than anger. It struck me with disbelief. How could people be so blind to the simplest lesson that water never submits? They boxed it in, ignorant of what every farmer, every rancher, every child who played in mud puddles knew. The stream would only gather behind their barrier, pressing, swelling, waiting for release. In days, the consequences bloomed like weeds. Upstream, a stagnant pool spread across my pasture. Mosquitoes hummed in thick clouds at dusk, heavier than I'd ever known. Ducks landed and paddled in the stagnant basin, mocking their claims of prevention. Wildlife grew restless. Frogs sang out of tune. Deer changed paths. And still Karen strutted, putting up aluminum signs on my fence posts declaring HOA property, warning of trespass. I laughed, photographed the lies, and added them to a folder I kept fattening with every bit of evidence. Letters came next, bright orange envelopes pinned to my gate accusing me of violations, fines stacking higher than thought possible. I tacked everyone neatly on the wall of my shed, a private gallery of their foolishness. When words and paper lost flavor, Karen herself arrived in her oversized SUV, honking at my gate, shouting that she was here for inspection. My gate was oak and steel, chained with links thick as a man's wrist and set into concrete posts deep under the gravel. She rammed the accelerator, tires spinning, clay flying, her wheels sinking until she stuck hard in the ditch. Her visor toppled, her designer shoes ruined by mud she couldn't control. The tow truck driver who hauled her out didn't look her in the eye, perhaps embarrassed for her. I didn't laugh that day. The land laughed for me. Still, arrogance never admits defeat. They held meetings and published newsletters painting me as a hostile recluse, endangering the neighborhood by refusing progress. One even accused me of hoarding water rights like a miser. Yet the splintering picture told the truth. I had inspectors lined up, documents copied, aerial maps marked with boundaries stretching back decades. Every photo of their trespass, every video of Karen rattling my gate, every recording of her absurd claims stacked in my binder. And above all, I had time and patience. My silence wasn't surrender. It was waiting. Because I knew a storm would come. And when it did, everything they had buried would rise again. The first storm teased the warning. Rain fell steady through a night, and by dawn the artificial pond behind the slab had doubled, water lapping the edges of my pasture. The creek gurgled and strained like a dog tugging at its leash. I sipped coffee, watching it climb, watching ducks clatter across the surface. Karen and her flock toasted champagne under umbrellas, congratulating themselves on their engineering. They laughed at me through the fence, claiming soon my cabin would flood instead of their homes. I nodded and said nothing, because thunder already grumbled in the hills. It took only 2 weeks for patience to earn its reward. Black clouds rolled over the valley, heavy and swollen with summer rain. The storm began with steady patter, then escalated into torrents that beat the tin roof like drums. Water poured over their gray wall, carving slits along the edges. Trickles turned to rivulets. On the second night, their subdivision lawns glistened under several inches of standing water. Decorative gnomes became islands, basements filled with an inch of murky seepage. Still, Karen marched bravely with clipboard, insisting it was a minor inconvenience. But water whispered differently. It pressed at every seam. By the third day, the deluge was biblical. The subdivision below my hill lay swallowed in a shallow lake. Mailboxes jutted from brown waves. Headlights glowed faint beneath water before flickering out. Dogs barked from porches, children clung to windows. I stood safe behind my gate, cabin dry on high ground where my father had wisely set it. The valley floor had become a bowl, water reclaiming what had been denied. That morning, HOA members, knee-deep in their own arrogance turned to panic, stormed my gate. They shouted accusations over the roar of rain. I had trapped water, I had locked it in, I had orchestrated their misery. Karen herself, soaked, mascara running, thrust her finger at me with shrieks that this was my fault. I let them speak, then simply pointed at the gray slab still holding the buckling pond. I reminded them I had warned them. The sheriff arrived then, cruiser tires throwing white spray, shoulders set beneath his hat. The crowd swarmed him, clamoring, accusing, gesturing toward me as though I were the architect of storms. He raised his hand, restored some silence, then asked me if I had anything to say. Calm as I could be, I handed him a folder wrapped in plastic. Inside were the photographs of concrete poured, the county inspector's report, the maps, the deeds, the timeline. He flipped through quietly, his face made of stone, then turned to the crowd. The dam was illegal, he said. The flood was on them. Not me. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping at the shoreline. The water behind her surged with laughter only I could hear. And by the fourth night, the creek delivered its final lesson. Lightning split the black sky, and with a roar that shook even my cabin, the concrete dam cracked, buckled, shattered. A wall of pent water surged downhill with fury, sweeping fences, gardens, rose bushes, even the pride of their manicured lawns. The subdivision drowned beneath its own arrogance while my porch lights glowed warm and dry. The days that followed stripped away the last veneer of Karen's power. Contractors shook their heads at shoddy work. Neighbors turned against her, demanding where their dues had gone. The county issued fines so large they would take years to pay. And the HOA, once so smug in its bylaws, lay fractured beyond repair. Karen resigned to booze in the town hall, her clipboard finally useless in her trembling hands. As for me, I hung a sign carved from oak on my gate. It read simply, Flood Control Manager. I let the creek sing again down its restored bed, free and fierce as it had always been. And I sat with my coffee, patient and quiet, knowing I hadn't beaten them with shouts or fists. Water had done that for me. Water and patience. And all I had truly done was stand firm at my gate, as steady as the land itself. The valley looked different after the storm. The sky had cleared, the sun sliding across the hills as though nothing violent had ever happened. Yet the scars of water told a truth no one could ignore. The subdivision below my cabin resembled a shipwreck site, lawns buried beneath silt, cars stranded half-submerged in mud, garden ornaments carried away and lodged in tangled fences. Walking the ridge above it all, I could still hear the faint trickle of my creek, freed at last from the suffocating slab of concrete the HOA had buried it under. It ran clear again, a thin silver ribbon winding through the pines, laughing quietly like it always used to. Nature had reclaimed its breath, and I could almost hear my father whispering, "I told you, son, you can't cage water." But for all the proof flowing beneath their ruined cul-de-sac, the HOA wasn't finished. If anything, the flood only sharpened their hunger for blame. Karen was the first voice to rise from the wreckage, visor gone, but her clipboard clutched tightly as though it still carried the authority her neighbors had given her. She stumbled through knee-deep muck, shouting from across the gate that I had orchestrated the disaster, that my refusal to grant access, my stubborn insistence on locking the gate, had trapped the storm until it swallowed their streets. The words sounded absurd in the fresh morning air, but grief and anger make people gullible, and many of them, their homes soaked and their floors ruined, were eager to believe her version. It is easier to blame a single man with boots on his porch than to admit you handed your faith to arrogance wearing a visor. I didn't answer her rage. I stood calm, arms crossed, the weight of my folder of evidence steady in the back of my mind. Every photo of cement poured, every video of contractors sneaking through my woods, every record of orange HOA fines pinned to my shed wall, all of it was there if she dared drag this into the courtroom she kept threatening. But the storm had already argued my case far better than paper ever could. Water had spoken with more eloquence than any lawyer. Still, I knew silence wasn't enough. After the storm, the county inspector returned, boots sinking into the silt that smeared across their streets. He wasn't surprised by what he saw. Standing beside me at the fence, raincoat still damp from days of weather, he shook his head and muttered one of those lines that stick to your ribs. They buried a creek under concrete. That's like trapping a wolf in a chicken coop and claiming you built a cage. It's going to break free and it's going to make a mess. That was the report he filed, red ink underlining words like illegal, violation, unpermitted, fines. The county board moved fast after nature's wrath left its stamp. The HOA was slapped with penalties so heavy I suspected their dues meetings would soon turn into fistfights. But Karen, ever the empress in her own mind, took a different route. She dragged herself and her board into my driveway again, standing at the locked steel gate with a lawyer in tow. He was younger, trying too hard, his expensive suit already splattered in mud, his voice rehearsed as he accused me of obstruction. He claimed that had I allowed access to my land during the flood, they could have drained the water sooner, perhaps saving their subdivision from the worst of it. I listened politely to his speech, then handed him a printed copy of Karen's own HOA newsletter, the one where she had proudly announced the improvement project across the creek. His voice faltered halfway through his argument as he read her words, black and white admission that the dam had been their doing, not mine. The sheriff backed me up that afternoon, leaning against his cruiser, arms folded, shaking his head at the spectacle. He reminded Karen that without permits their construction was illegal, that pressing their trespass further would risk real charges. The lawyer muttered something about further review, but anyone with eyes knew the case was already collapsing like the wall their contractors had built. That week the subdivision turned inward, its neighbors whispering at fences, voices heavy with resentment. Rebuilding would cost money, and the fines layered on top of contractor bills only made them angrier. The very residents who had once cheered Karen on began turning against her. I saw it in their glances up the hill, not just hatred aimed like before, but doubt, seeds of betrayal sprouting in the mud. They had followed her promises blindly, and now they were the ones paying with flooded basements and ruined furniture while my cabin stood untouched. It was the cruel symmetry of arrogance, that the ruler never pays the price until the crowd finally demands it. Still, despite the mounting pressure from her neighbors, Karen refused to step down. She launched a new wave of letters, thicker envelopes this time, threatening fresh lawsuits and claiming I had endangered public safety. I pinned them to the wall of my shed alongside the earlier ones, page after page of hollow intimidation pressed between nails like trophies. Neighbors who used to cheer her stayed silent at her side, and others began to slip copies of meeting minutes under my gate, evidence of how far she was willing to go in shredding truth to hold power. As the weeks crawled on, I noticed something else. The land itself was beginning to heal, faster than their homes could. My creek, now freed, sang louder each morning, rushing more boldly where the concrete had been shattered apart. Wildlife returned. Deer bent their heads to drink. Birds nested again. Frogs croaked in chorus at dusk. It was as though the valley exhaled in relief, cleansing itself of their arrogance. Upstream, flowing water flushed away the stagnant mosquito tomb they had created, sweeping clean what their bureaucracy had poisoned. The irony was almost too sharp. Where their subdivision smelled of mildew and rot, my land smelled of pine needles and fresh currant. The HOA scrambled with emergency meetings, trying to scrape enough funding for repairs and removal. Word drifted to me from sympathetic voices that homeowners were furious. Dues had doubled, new assessments levied, bills stacked high. Money that should have gone to repaint fences or pave their cul-de-sac was instead being shoveled toward undoing Karen's fiasco. People whispered openly about dissolving the HOA altogether. Families muttered about suing the board rather than me. The very empire Karen built on micromanagement and intimidation was crumbling at its foundations. Not because I had lifted a finger against her, but because truth and water had teamed up to expose her. I kept preparing, patient as always. Copies of deeds tucked in multiple binders, videos backed up on drives left with friends in town, gates reinforced, cameras sharper, evidence stacked like cordwood. Not because I thought Karen could win, but because I respected arrogance enough to know it never bows quietly. I was building a fortress of truth to weather the tantrum she would inevitably throw. The turning point came when the county sent official crews to supervise removal of what remained of the dam. Standing at my porch, mug in hand, I watched jackhammers echo across the valley as concrete fragments fell into the stream and were dragged away by current. Each strike of iron against stone felt like a hymn, a rhythm of justice. Karen stood there too, visor gone, her posture sagging as neighbors muttered behind her. She barked orders nobody listened to, flailed her arms like someone still pretending to command, and all the while the creek roared louder, freed from its chokehold, declaring openly what everyone now knew. When contractors shook their heads at the shoddy work and laughed about the incompetence of whoever had designed it, I caught my neighbors stealing looks at Karen, some openly shrugging at one another in exhaustion. Her days of authority leaked away like floodwater down a drain, and I stayed silent, standing behind my gate, a calm witness to their collapse. When one guilt-stricken homeowner approached, half apologizing, muttering they had never wanted this fight, I merely answered with the only truth that mattered: water never forgets. Try to silence it, bury it, redirect it, and it will wait. It waited behind their dam. It waited behind their arrogance, and it came back in a rush that humbled them all. Karen resigned weeks later. They said the vote in the community hall wasn't even close. Shouted questions she couldn't answer filled the room. Where were the permits? Where had the money gone? Why had she ignored every warning? She left without the visor, without fanfare, without a kingdom, and the HOA, stripped and limping, carried on in name alone, a shell that nobody respected anymore. The creek flowed on. Ducks splashed, trout flickered, deer drank in peace. My cabin stood dry, my gate locked firm, my sign beside it carved in oak: Flood Control Manager. A joke, yes, but also a truth, because I hadn't needed to outshout them, outspend them, or outfight them. I had only needed to trust the law of the land, the patience of preparation, and the certainty that water always wins when arrogance tries to cage it. The storm was gone, but the scars it left behind clung to the valley like shadows that refused to lift. Weeks had passed since the night the dam had split apart, since water thundered downhill in a roaring curtain of mud and debris that swallowed lawns, basements, and egos. The sun returned and the hills glowed green again, yet the subdivision below still bore a wound no paint job or manicured hedge could hide. Their neat symmetry of beige siding was broken, driveways still stained brown, gardens left hollow where topsoil had been clawed away. You could smell mildew in the air every time the breeze drifted up from town. My land, on the other hand, had already begun to heal. The creek ran quick and alive once more, darting between rocks clear enough to see the flick of trout tails beneath its surface. Frogs croaked again at dusk. Deer came back to drink under the cover of pines. It was like the valley itself sighed in relief, grateful to be breathing again. I knew then what I had suspected all along. The creek wasn't something you own, it's something you answer to. And the HOA had mocked that truth until it drowned them in their own stubborn blindness. But broken egos never heal quietly. Karen might have been stripped of her title, Her grip on the subdivision finally snapped, but the embers of her arrogance still glowed. In the weeks after her resignation, her allies tried one last time to push back. Orange envelopes appeared again at my gate, stamped with HOA logos as though their bylaws held any authority over me. The letters accused me of negligence, insisting I had caused property values to plummet and demanding restitution for the disaster. I tacked each one on the shed wall right next to the rest of their gallery of stupidity. The wood groaned under the weight of their wasted paper. On one particularly hot afternoon, 2 board members who still clung to Karen's ghost arrived at my gate in polos and khakis, voices puffed with false authority. They rattled the steel bars, announced they were conducting a final inspection, and demanded entry. I leaned against the post, arms folded, and told them calmly they had no jurisdiction here, that the county had already closed the book on this fight. When they pressed harder, I pointed at the cameras mounted in the trees, blinking red in the sun. Their shoulders slumped, their little charade collapsing as they trudged back down the muddy road. Truth had grown legs since the flood, and there was no taking it back. County papers, environmental reports, photographs of cracks forming days before the collapse, all of it lived in my binder, and all of it had been backed by the unstoppable proof of water itself. Their accusations had no more bite than a dead dog's bark. The sheriff himself stopped by once, leaned against his cruiser, and told me the county was done entertaining their nonsense. "They'll keep flailing for a while," he said, "but it's over. Water has a way of ending arguments better than any man." Watching the HOA unravel from a distance was like watching weeds wither after the sun scorches them too long. They held meetings still, at least for a while. Neighbors crowded into their echoing clubhouse, but the energy had died. Homeowners muttered about money wasted, dues doubled, insurance premiums spiking. Fingers pointed not at me anymore, but at each other. Where once their newsletters had been filled with bylaw mandates about lawn height and mailbox paint, now they dripped with subtle blame, neighbors accusing neighbors for lapses in judgment. Karen herself became little more than a ghost story. Some said she had moved away quietly, unable to face the daily reminder of her failure. Others claimed she was holed up in her house, blinds drawn, ashamed to walk through a neighborhood that once bowed its head at her clipboard. Either way, her crown was gone, and the silence of her name spoke louder than her screeches ever had. But the creek spoke loudest. It had become more than just water again. It became witness, evidence, and judge. Each morning I sat on my porch, coffee warming my hands, and listened to it rush against rock, reclaiming channels that had been scarred by concrete. It sang the oldest song I'd ever known. Neighbors would drive past slowly, eyes lingering on the free-flowing stream as if it mocked them, reminding them of their foolishness. Some lowered their eyes when they caught sight of me, ashamed. A few even stopped by my gate to offer apologies. One man, his voice rough as gravel, told me quietly that he voted to support the dam but regretted it now, that his basement still stank of mold, and his trust in boards and bylaws was broken for good. I told him it wasn't me he ought to apologize to. It was the land. His shoulders sagged, but he nodded as though he understood. Over time, I began to realize that this fight was never really me versus an HOA. It was arrogance versus truth. They believed their votes and charts could override the bone-deep laws written into rivers and earth. But water doesn't bend to clipboards. It bends only to gravity, time, and patience. Karen had tried to bury a living creek under dead stone, and the creek had answered on its own terms. Evidence against the HOA piled so high that it outgrew even my patience for collecting it. Certified letters from the county declaring the dam illegal. Courtroom fines rendered in amounts that made homeowners sweat through their meetings. Contractors' reports mocking the amateur construction. Even environmental agencies stepped in, issuing requirements for rehabilitation. The HOA board spent months mired in lawsuits and bills, the very foundation of their authority rotting from beneath them. By the end, all I had to do was sit still, watch, and let arrogance collapse into silence. And collapse it did. The subdivision, once proud of its beige conformity, fell quiet. Homeowners stopped obsessing over lawn centimeters and paint shades. The HOA's newsletters dwindled until they ceased altogether. The clubhouse doors were locked more often than not. Without Karen's iron grip, they lost control of the little empire they had built. By the following year, whispers reached me that they were debating dissolving the HOA entirely. Some wanted to keep the name alive, others knew it was pointless. By then, nobody cared enough to argue at length. The storm had done the arguing for them. As for me, I returned to my peace. Life on the ranch was simple again. Mending fences, chopping wood, watching the creek sparkle under sunlight. Nature filled the valley with reminders of resilience. Songbirds that nested in branches washed clean by rain. Deer returning to paths they had once avoided. Wildflowers sprouting in the soft soil the flood had left behind. Every evening the creek gleamed gold beneath the setting sun, as if proud to show off its freedom. One evening Hank, an old neighbor who had been a quiet ally through the fight, came by with 2 beers. He sat on my porch, looked out across the valley, and chuckled under his breath. "Funny thing," he said. "Nobody even remembers what Karen claimed the dam was for. All they remember is the flood. All they remember is how it broke." I laughed with him, deep, unrestrained. He was right. Their so-called mosquito hazard was long forgotten. Their arguments dissolved like their concrete, washed away in the current. What lived on was the image of water reclaiming its rightful course, a force no signature or vote could deny. The irony of it all sat heavy in me but left me smiling. The HOA had tried to tame the creek in the name of community safety, only to drown their own homes in their vanity. They had tried to punish me with false fines, only to bankrupt themselves with real penalties. They had tried to break me with slander, only to break their own unity instead. And through it all, I never had to raise my voice, never breached my gate, never fought with fists. I simply stood steady, let nature argue on my behalf, and trusted that water doesn't forget. Months later, I carved one last sign. Oak board, smooth and clean, with letters burned deep into its grain. I hung it on the gate beside my flood control manager plaque. It read, "This land answers only to nature." Nothing more needed to be said. Every neighbor who passed saw it. Some shook their heads. Others smiled beneath their guilt. All of them knew it was truth, carved not by my hand, but by the storm that had proved stronger than any law in their bylaws. And as I sat once more with coffee on my porch, the creek whispering steady and alive, I realized the battle was over, not because I had won, but because I refused to lose. Water does the rest,